Hi there, I'm Jen, this is Remembered Reads, and this is going to be my wrap-up for the last 10 days of June of 2017. If you saw my last couple of videos, you will know that I've just moved. This is the new house now behind me. We've gotten a lot of things unpacked. I still have to hang some pictures, as you can see. I haven't quite worked out the lighting in here. I do have lights behind me, but there's also a tree right outside, so I don't think the lighting is great. So I don't know if I'll keep filming in front of these shelves, but we'll see. Anyway, let's talk about some books. So the last thing that I read right before we moved was Sebastian Barry's The Temporary Gentleman, which is linked to a number of his other novels in that it involves this McNulty family. The main character in this is Jack McNulty, and 99% of the book is narrated in the style of being that character's diary. He is recently basically retired from the British Foreign Service. He is in Ghana, where he has basically overstayed his colonial position because it's just become independent, and he's musing about his life with his, at this point, dead wife and his children, and his relationship with the three of them. So interspersed in between the bits about him in Ghana in 1957 are bits about him courting his wife in Ireland in the 1920s and his children being raised. The main character is basically someone who has made not huge mistakes in his life, but he has issues with drinking and gambling and has effectively ruined his chances at happiness and also ruined his wife's happiness. He loses houses, he runs away into the British military and into the British Foreign Service. So he misses huge parts of his children's lives, and he's missing out on being aware of what's happening in his wife's emotional life, so that he has an image of her that is not really part of reality. A lot of which seems like this would be a very emotionally character-driven story, but it is not. Everything is very much held at arm's length. There's one point where his gambling debts cause them to lose his wife's family house, which should be heart-wrenching. And reading about it, you do feel for the wife, but reading it through the filter of the character, it's almost distant. You look at it and think, I should feel sad about that, but somehow I don't, because I'm reading it through the filter of this man who is basically oblivious to the damage that he's doing to his family. Similarly, there is a child who's stillborn in this, and I think that's one of those situations where I think it's difficult to write that in an unemotional way, and yet it is completely flat. There's no emotion to it at all, which is kind of mind-blowing, because I think there is a lot of cheesy, poorly written fiction that still kind of plays with your heartstrings in that kind of plot. But in this, it's incredibly flat to a point that I actually put the book down and said, you know, why am I not emotionally engaged with that? And I think it's because this is structured to be about this guy who is so removed from his own life that you can't feel it, even though you clearly should be feeling something for this situation. I found that to be incredibly well done, because I think that's a hard style to write in. But on the flip side, it also meant that it wasn't particularly compelling. I was curious to read more about this guy's journey and how, the other ways in which he can ruin bits of his or his wife's and children's lives. There wasn't a particular draw. You almost want to say that's a shame, but it's clearly a stylistic choice, which is an interesting stylistic choice. It's just not super compelling. There are clear parallels being made between him being part of this generation that grew up in this newly independent Ireland and then making the choice to be an agent of British colonialism in Ghana. And there are parallels that are very lightly drawn, but I expected there to be more commentary to that, but the absence of commentary is almost a statement on its own. So that was interesting. I was pleased to have read this, but as I said, it was not super compelling. So if you were looking for something to draw you in, this is probably not that. But as an exercise in writing really emotional topics from an almost impressive emotional distance, I thought it does that bit well. So the next thing that I picked up, I actually read while waiting for the gas technician to show up at the new house before we had furniture here. And that is How to Keep Rolling After a Fall by Karole Cozzo. I've mentioned before I have a friend who's a school librarian, and I occasionally read books that she needs to review before she adds to the school library, and just to share opinions about them. So I was reading this with that in mind, as opposed to reading this for myself. It's basically a teenage romance between a girl who was expelled because she was part of a group of mean girls and they cyberbullied someone, and a boy who is a fairly recent wheelchair user after a car accident, and sappiness ensues. I suppose it's a bit of an interesting choice for the author to pick the main character and the narrator to be a bully as opposed to someone who was bullied, because I think that's the more standard story that they tell. The weird choice in this is that the girl really frames herself as being a victim because her friends who also engaged in the cyberbullying weren't punished and she was. So there's never a real sense that she regrets having done things, which is maybe realistic, but is a weird choice for a children's book. There were pros and cons to the male main character. On the one hand, his disability is sort of presented as something that's being used as a plot point, which I think is not a great way to use disability, especially, again, in a children's story. On the one hand, you could argue that there are some negative stereotypes about, how do I put this, sexual performance issues with people who have had spinal cord injuries, and it definitely goes against that stereotype, which I think is a positive thing. And, you know, the guy gets the girl. I don't think that's a spoiler to share that. This is obviously a teenage romance, so they are clearly going to hook up at the end. But the weird thing, since I'm talking about the disability element, I don't think the author decided what level of spinal cord injury the guy has, because at various points he comments that he doesn't have great dexterity anymore, which would suggest that he's a low-level quadriplegic, and he plays wheelchair rugby, which would suggest that he's a low-level quadriplegic. However, they mention, like, paraplegia several times, and the girl keeps commenting on his body and, like, with the cliched below the waist. So I came away with the impression that she hadn't decided what his injury level was, which was weird when you're using disability as part of the plot point. As you could probably tell, I was not a huge fan of this, and what I'm telling my friend is that it's about, you know, not super likable people, but at least the guy in the wheelchair gets the girl. I don't know. I don't know what the author's motivation in writing this in that way was, because there are some interesting bits, but yeah. So after that, as I was unpacking, and I ended up rereading Warren Ellis's Black Summer, which came out about 10 years ago originally. It is one of his sort of superhero deconstructions. I often hear this described as being a less interesting Watchmen, which is probably not completely unfair. A rogue superhero has killed a bunch of political figures, and his old team gets together to fight him, and there's some political commentary, but not a lot. It is not the most interesting superhero deconstruction. This is a book that I would describe as good enough. I still really enjoy Warren Ellis's style of action writing. I'm not a super huge fan of the art in this particular book, but it does what it's intended to do. It's just not anything particularly new or particularly different. It doesn't stand out amongst all of the other superhero deconstruction style books that Ellis was writing at the time. If you look at other things that he was writing around the same time, like Scars, it's not at that level. So. And then finally, digging through that same box of comics, I picked up The Chronicles of Wormwood, The Last Battle, which is written by Garth Ennis and drawn by Oscar Jimenez. Love the art. I love Garth Ennis's writing. I think he's hilarious. This is probably not a book that needed to be written. There were no cliffhangers at the end of the original Chronicles of Wormwood, but this is fun in a kind of they're getting the band back together. With the original Chronicles of Wormwood, I thought it was great fun to see how Garth Ennis had really matured as a writer since he wrote Preacher, and then do a book that does the same kind of combination of gross out humor and religious commentary that Preacher did. So the original Chronicles of Wormwood felt like a really interesting revisiting of those themes. This one, not so much, but it's still fun. So if you like that style of humor and commentary that Garth Ennis does, I think this is great fun. You know, you've got Danny, the son of Satan, Jay, who's the second coming of Jesus, and their talking rabbit sidekick. Wackiness ensues. The ridiculous Australian Pope Jacko is back possessing someone. It's ridiculous. If you like this kind of thing, it's ridiculously great fun. If you don't like this kind of thing, you will hate this. And then I started another book, which is M.G. Vizingi's When She Was Queen, which I'm not going to talk about yet because I'll talk about this next month, but that's what's on the go now. Anyway, that was the end of this month. I'm going to go finish unpacking now. I'm probably going to unhaul books, but I don't know if I'm going to do a video about that. We'll see. If you're Canadian, I hope you had a great Canada Day. If you're American, have a good 4th of July tomorrow. If you're anywhere else, I hope you had a good weekend. That's it for now. Ciao.